All right, so we're going to go ahead and shift gears and talk about the Tejano experience in World War I. Our second presenter is Dr. Emilio Zamora. Dr. Zamora is a professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. He has prepared or collaborated in the production of 10 monographs and has won numerous book and article prizes. Zamora is the second vice president of the Texas State Historical Association, and he's also the 2017 Scholar of the Year with the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies, and the 2017 Lifetime Achievement Award from the state chapter of the same organization. Dr. Zamora's talk is sponsored by the Texas State Historical Association. Please welcome Dr. Zamora.
You know, anytime you present in a function of this sort, you're always influenced by the people that come before you. There was a very important statement you made there about the women being basically moral witnesses to war, and that one of the major issues in war is peace. And I wanted to add some things to that based on my presentation on José de la Luz Saenz and the World War I diary that he wrote and published in 1933. One of the thoughts that I had as I was listening to you, aside from the fact that women and others, as well as soldiers and the civilians who are caught up in wars, you know, they see the war firsthand. And they become, in many ways, the peacemakers because they see the horror of war. They see it firsthand. That's an undisputable fact that they are seeing things firsthand. The only way we can get as close to that horrific experience, which is war, which also involves experiences in the concentration camps, the low-intensity warfare on the border in the 19th century, the wars in Central America, and so forth. All of these violent confrontations involve these first-hand accounts that we often hear now and then. If we're not there at that moment, the next best thing that we can do is read diaries. Diaries are very different from memoirs. As important as memoirs are, they're written after the fact, based on memory. And so we don't know how trustworthy, we really don't know how trustworthy those accounts are. When we find diaries, one of the first things we have to do is to determine the trustworthiness of these diaries, because diaries are special. They basically offer these first-hand accounts, so it's necessary to be able to establish that these first-hand accounts are trustworthy. One of the things that I've done with the diary by José de la Luz Saenz is that I've gone and looked at the postcards that he wrote while he was in the trenches in World War I, the postcards that he sent home along with other pieces of paper. I went and looked at these postcards and compared his entries in these postcards, which are dated and reappear in the diary. They're almost verbatim reproductions of what he wrote at the moment that he was in the trenches. So this diary is very important because it brings us very close to this horrific side of war. War is not just simply a matter of a part of diplomatic relations or the establishment of creation of armies and so forth. It involves experiences at the point of death that produces the dread of dying, the shock of seeing your buddies torn up into pieces. Well, of course, they should be the moral witnesses to the war. In other words, these soldiers are drawing opinions on this horror. In order to get to those opinions, those of us that are now looking back to that period, we need to go to accounts like the ones that appear in the World War I diary of José de la Luz Saenz. We have very few of them. We're very fortunate that this man took the time to sit down every day for almost 11 months. He missed about 4 or 5 days, and wrote something down from the point that he was inducted until he's released from military service. What is really amazing about this, he's able to transcend the horror that he's witnessing and experiencing, and is able to write so well and so deliberately. So this is one of my favorite works that I've engaged, in part because of the subject matter. José de la Luz Saenz is a war hero. He's a war hero primarily because he gives us this account of what it must have been like for all the soldiers who fought in World War I. And it explains why it is that these soldiers became peacemakers immediately after the war, and he during the war. So let me show you some images and then make some remarks about him and his diary. This is José de la Luz Saenz. He was born in the late 1800s, born outside of Alice, attended the public schools in Alice, Texas, and also attended an independent Mexican school. Mexican communities established independent Mexican schools that teach children Spanish and Mexican history and cultural activities, identity, in part because the public official schools didn't do that. The public official schools, for the most part, excluded the children or just allowed them to come up to the 4th grade during this time period. So these private independent schools are being established for 2 reasons: to compensate for the decision by the school officials not to give Mexican-American children an education, but also because they wanted to reinforce their own cultural identity and history. So he attended both schools in Alice and became a bilingual, very well informed about the history of the U.S. as well as Mexico and so forth. He graduated from Alice High School, a very good school at the time, and became a teacher himself. At that time, most teachers didn't go to teachers' colleges. Some of the best performing students would join up with a master teacher and participate in institutes in the bigger cities to get some training on teaching and become teachers. He became a teacher for 40 years, beginning in the 1910s. And this is important for 2 reasons. He became a champion of Mexican children and a strong critic of school segregation. He also gained great respect in the community because he's assuming a very important position in the community. He is providing an education that is much needed by the children. So he's pretty learned. He's very committed to the education of these children, so committed that he speaks publicly on their behalf. And he teaches in segregated schools. Most Mexican origin children, when they're admitted, they're only allowed to participate in public schools up to the 4th, maybe the 5th grade. So he's teaching these very large classes of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders for the most part. This is a book that he publishes in 1933. He is released from active duty in 1919. He collates all his notes, brings them together, adds some commentary in the beginning and at the end, and he publishes it in Spanish in 1933 with Artes Gráficas, a publisher from San Antonio that is well known throughout the Americas. They publish a lot of Spanish language materials. He publishes that book there. And this is a photograph. There's only a couple of photographs that we found of José de la Luz Saenz with his students. This is a school, an all-Mexican school in Moore, Texas, south of San Antonio. And you notice that there's different ages in the children. Mr. Saenz is over on the top to the right. When he returns from the First World War and starts working on his diary, he's also teaching and is very actively involved at the public square. He's going to the public square and speaking as a Mexican on behalf of Mexican children against school segregation. He joins up with other very important civil rights leaders. And in 1929, they formed the League of Latin American Citizens, LULAC, an organization that still exists today. It was formed in 1929 in Corpus Christi. And these are the founders. And he appears somewhere in there, in the middle to the left, right up through this row. So he's a pretty important fellow. Very successful academically, serves in the military. Service in the military is very important for Mexicans at this point. They are, for all practical purposes, socially marginalized. They're an ethnic minority. During the war, particularly, especially when earlier than the war, before 1917, during the Mexican Revolution, during that period and even before that, Mexicans are suspect of being un-American because in many cases, some of them are involved in the San Diego Revolt. They're revolting against U.S. authority in South Texas. There is also labor activity and civil rights activity. So there's a reaction to the leadership of the Mexican-American community. They're accused of being disloyal to the U.S. by creating divisions, undermining national unity, and so forth. The war then provides an opportunity for people like José de la Luz Saenz. Some people refuse to serve. He does. The people that refuse to serve, many of them, refuse to serve because they say, and we found these statements in the newspapers and even in his own papers, are refusing to participate in the war, and they argue, because they've never been treated like Americans. Why should they be Americans now? Why should they answer the call to military service in 1917? There's another group that José de la Luz Saenz represents. That group, in leadership positions, is saying, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to demonstrate loyalty. We are from here. We are of Mexican origin, but we have to live here. We have to work here. We have to raise our children here. Future generations depend on us to resolve some of these problems. And one of the most obvious ways to do it is by serving in the military and demonstrating our loyalty. These people that served, they are also promoting the idea of acculturation. Military service itself is an instrument for acculturation. In other words, there are people that are consciously, like José de la Luz Saenz, making a decision to incorporate themselves into American society by demonstrating loyalty, and they're embracing this opportunity to acculturate, and there's no better place to acculturate than the military. The military, by and large, there are a lot of very important exceptions, but by and large, is like sports. They treat you according to your merits, and not necessarily, not always on the basis of your ethnic background. When you're in the military, you develop what people call Foxhole Democracy. In other words, you learn to depend on your fellow soldier. That's part of acculturation, because these people then come back with the idea that they should expect friendly relations with people outside the Mexican community. And in fact, there are people outside the Mexican-American community who have served and who have seen and been impressed by Mexican origin soldiers and all that they do, the sacrifice that they make. Here's José de la Luz Saenz after 29, I think it's around the 1930s. He's very active in veterans organizations, and here he's participating in one of these conferences by a veterans organization in San Antonio. He's very proud of his military service, and he uses military service for purposes of securing civil rights, equal civil rights for Mexicans. This is an image of the 90th Division, the division that he served in, as they're being released from active duty. And he's among those people. We don't know how many Mexicans served in World War I. Nobody has really done a count. It's very difficult to do that. But there's a substantial number, and it's pretty obvious from the diary. But let me say something obvious, because he talks about people serving in different regiments in the 90th Division. They get together. They have gatherings. The Mexicans get together to celebrate the day of San Juan, for example, St. John's Day. They get together for other purposes. They get together in groups of 50, 75. They're in touch with each other. They get together when they bury their own, and they talk, and he records all of this. The book, the diary, For José La Luz Saenz, is a record of military experience. He says, first and foremost, what I'm doing is creating a record to show the world what the American soldier, as well as other soldiers, have gone through, a very difficult experience facing horrific situations. The second reason he's doing it, he says, is to create a record for the Mexicans in particular. He says, Mexicans are making the ultimate sacrifice on the battlefields and are spilling their blood next to the French blood and the blood of other soldiers. We are one. We deserve to be treated equally on the basis of that sacrifice. And he says, future generations, when you read this diary, know that that sacrifice is for you too, so that you can then use our sacrifice to argue for equal rights in the future. That's a second reason he's writing this book. How does he make that? I think both arguments are very important. I'm going to focus only on the second general argument. How does he go about presenting himself not only as a moral witness to war, but a Mexican moral witness to war? What does he say about the war? How is he using the experience of the war to record the Mexican experience? Well, he's arguing, number one, that Mexicans are making the ultimate sacrifice on the battlefields like everybody else. That's the first thing he says. The second thing that he says that is very important is that he says, in Europe, we're fighting for democracy and justice, okay? We're fighting for the same principles at home. So he analogizes the war in Europe with the fight for equal rights at home. He says, to the extent that the war in Europe is justified because of those important principles, our fight for equal rights at home is equally justified. That's a powerful argument. This is during a time period when Mexicans are considered, dumb Mexicans. What is it? Who was it? One of the historians who wrote about the San Diego Revolt at one point said they couldn't have known. They didn't have the intellectual capacity to even dream up such a thing. Imagine Mexicans thinking they could rise up in arms or write manifestos declaring themselves equal to whites. This man is demonstrating great intellectual strength, a great political resolve, and that's one of the reasons why this book is so important. He does a third thing, and I'm going to read some excerpts from the diary to give you a sense of how he says these things, these three arguments. The fight over there is equal to the fight here. The sacrifice can be used in the future. But he's also using a concept used a lot in political history in Latin America, forjar. The term forjando una nación is very, very kind of an uplifting, high-sounding phrase. When people are doing that, when they're forging a nation, they're doing something that is very deep and important. He says, Mexicans are forging a nation. This nation is never complete. It's always in process. We are trying to live up to the principles that define us, always. We never reach the top, but we always strive. And Mexicans are part of that process. We're trying to create a more perfect union. And we're doing it by demonstrating loyalty. It's not just for the purposes of gaining the favor from other people. We're participating in something that we believe in. We believe in justice and democracy, and so forth, okay? This idea of forging a nation is very important in my mind. that I think a lot of people overlook in the history of Mexican Americans. So let me read something that I think captures some of these arguments that I'm sharing with you. The first entry that I'm going to read is the entry he writes as he's passing New Braunfels on a train after boot camp on the way to France, on the way to New York to be shipped to France. But on the way over there, he's on a train and he does an entry which says something about how he sees himself now as he's going into the war. The community he's passing by is called Dittlinger. That's the community outside New Braunfels where all the Mexican working families live, and they have a separate school. We are traveling in a car named Inverary. My friends have chosen the lower berth, and I have taken the top one. At sundown, we passed by Dittlinger, a quarry worked by many men of my raza. I didn't translate the word raza. Raza means community for all practical purposes. This is where I taught or was in charge of their children's school for a year. That combination of work camp and community is another battlefield. I waged battles until I got the county to pay the teacher who taught our children. Those were the kinds of victories I sought in civilian life, opening the school doors for the workers' children. Now that I wear the warrior's uniform, I hope to win other battles and bring justice to our people as we join an afflicted humanity that is calling for the sacrifice of conscious and free-thinking men. This is exactly, meaning the classroom, where the idea to pick up my rifle occurred to me. I was moved by the bad treatment many members of my raza face in these places. Ingrates, they deny us equality and forget the 1,001 guarantees given to their ancestors when they settled these lands. So he's got a sense of history, and he's pretty well resolved. He's resolved to state things as he sees them. Then this is a beautiful, very poetic statement, which is really fascinating because, again, as I said, he's able to transcend the horror of the war and write so well and so beautifully and so clearly. I find that particularly inspiring. It's hard enough to write with good lighting in a well-ventilated room. Imagine in a trench while they're firing at you. My favorite time to work on the diary was the twilight hours, usually with the reliable help of the flickering light of a paraffin candle. I wrote as the events unfolded, as the scenes that I observed were moving me. I wrote in the barracks, where we enjoyed the gift of electrical light, and at French billets, far from clear danger but within earshot of the constant artillery rumble from the horrendous front. I wrote in dugouts, our covered underground holes. Sometimes I simply wrote with the sky as my cover, sometimes blue, sometimes covered with thick clouds, yielding the unrelenting rain that often fell over France. That's beautiful writing. Once they got close to the front, right before they're sent to the Argonne offensive, he participated in 2 major ones. They were asked to write the letters to their loved ones in case they died. And so he wrote a number of letters. They were only supposed to write 1 letter. He wrote a letter to his wife, to his children, to his father, to his fellow countrymen, Mexicans, and to the government. I'll read you a couple. My dear wife, this is my last letter to you. The moment had to arrive sooner or later. It is here. Cry for me. I can understand this since we know how much you care for me and are recalling the difficult and happy times in our lives. You're also concerned about my children growing up as orphans. While you wait for the calm that is to come, know that my sacrifice was necessary. And more than necessary, it was honorable. It was 1,000 times honorable to have fallen for the inalienable rights of humankind and the future well-being of our children. You may think that they had everything with me there, but this is not the case. As long as the horrible and long-standing prejudice continues in Texas against our raza, our happiness will never be complete. I would not have been a man had I fled the draft to avoid the scorn where I was born and expected to die. The fight for the rights of the oppressed gives us the opportunity to claim justice for the humiliations and difficulties that we often face because we carry the indelible features of our raza. Our purpose is to demonstrate our dignity as a people before the whole world. It is necessary to fall where the best have died, and you can be sure that I will have fallen as a man of worth. It's a powerful statement about his values. I'm going to read the one to the raza. He says, to my raza, to my people. He says, do not forget that we have fallen fighting for the sole purpose of holding our good name high. Living without the rights of free men is not living. We are demonstrating once and for all that we are good enough to fight for those rights so that society extends them to us in the future. We will no longer be responsible if you do not educate your children after the war. Educate them until they are fully aware of their obligations and rights as good citizens. Do this so we can rest in peace. That's his long arm extending to our present. To the government, he has a long statement. I'll read only part of it. The book, by the way, is on sale, Texas A&M table. We only expect justice as we fall in battle. As far as we are concerned, we have demonstrated the worth of our raza. We hope, well, let's end it there. Now I want to read something about these horrific scenes that he talks about throughout the book that I think are very much at the center of all of this. Okay. Casualties. I titled this Casualties. When the black smoke cleared, the black smoke of the cannonade, we saw Juan get up. Hipólito was on the ground trying to get up on his feet. A large, sharp fragment had torn through his gas mask. It also went through his raincoat, thick jacket, and shirt, all new and made of wool. His chest, the thorax area, was torn open from side to side, but miraculously his lungs and heart were intact, although they came close to slipping out every time Hasso spoke and took a breath. He would say, it's nothing, and would brace his chest with his hands to breathe and walk. The healthy young man did not seem to be affected by the wound and the loss of blood. He did not want to leave his company and his friends, Juan and Amado Aguilar. So many others get a scratch and ask to be sent to the hospital, while others, this is no exaggeration, have shot themselves in their hands or feet to avoid participating in the offensive. It was not easy convincing Hasso to go to a field hospital. This is another scene that he describes. It reminds us this is war. And throughout he criticizes, of course, the decisions by the leadership and the generals who are just telling the soldiers to charge against the cannons and the machine guns and so forth. We went to bed prepared for the sacrifice. They were going to attack the next day. Yet recognizing that it would be useless to give in to our anxieties by dismissing the danger around us, we were defying death itself. We did have our moments of deep contrition, solemn occasions when we acknowledge our insignificance next to the noble cause we serve. Nothing within a circumference of the 5 kilometers was safe. It was the same everywhere, in the woods, foothills, valleys, and roads. None of us can forget, even if we wanted, the loud, frightful sound of the mortar rounds the Germans were using to finish us. We could hear the shells coming out of the mouths of cannon as if they were vomiting them. We followed their sound as they rose to some unknown height, paused momentarily, and then descended in search of their prey. The shells crashed on Mother Earth with their electrical discharges and dreadful explosions. They poured their deadly cargo and fragments over us. He is speaking for the soldiers, to us, including the Mexican soldiers. He's talking about now the soldiers as they're in the trenches. Their words were not kind, although they did not bear ill will. They're cussing. Their language is simply the most natural expression by desperate soldiers sensing imminent danger. The Germans began directing a terrible barrage at us that immediately triggered a response from our artillery. The duel would not have been unusual, except that it reminded us of a position in the middle of no man's land. The shells crisscrossed over our heads and emptied the dreaded shrapnel on us. They accomplished what they set out to do. The shelling made our march more difficult and even made it tougher to find our way through the thick forest. The shells were so numerous and they exploded so often that they practically lighted up the bare trees. We would have preferred to march under the cover of darkness. When it became obvious that we could not find our way out of the forest, we were ordered to seek shelter in foxholes. The incessant bombing lasted for a good while. We could hear the shells howling as they flew over us. In much the same way the souls must scream in eternal hell. I'm not exaggerating. The different caliber fire was so intense that many shells met in midair and exploded, raining shrapnel on us. The destruction of the forest was dreadful. No one spoke. Everyone was quiet as we took in everything. It seemed an unbelievable dream. This is an amazing scene. Now, you may think I'm overdoing this by selecting these entries. They're all over the place, but it's important that you be reminded this is a war. They're actual experiences of soldiers in war, and they're undergoing these feelings. They dread the death, and many, of course, are dying. It's important that we acknowledge that. Hear the voice of the soldier. He's speaking for the soldiers, in particular Mexican soldiers. One of the most poignant scenes in the diary were of numerous casualties that Saenz observed. One of them showed Saenz's ethnographic-like description of horrific scenes, like the aftermath of a violent encounter between a Mexican and a German soldier who had fought to the end the previous night. This is his quote: "They ended up leaning against each other in a narrow trench. The night's rain worked its miracle by washing the blood. They still looked alive as if they were in good health and with the full vigor of life. They had barely released their grip over the rifles that propped them up. All their blood collected at their feet. It would soon turn into mud, worms, stench, and murky matter, a fatal end." I'll stop there. I have a couple more quotes, but again, my point is that in a meeting of this sort, if we're going to talk about war, we need to acknowledge that there are moral witnesses to that war that are deeply moved by the war and that are commenting on that war at the moment that the war is occurring, at the front, in the trenches, and that we do a great disservice to participants in the war, not only the soldiers, but the civilians that get caught up. There's a lot of civilians that are dying as well in all of these wars. I think we do a great disservice to all of these people if we don't bring in their firsthand accounts. And think about that I think these are the best, strongest arguments against war. So the most important issue in war, I guess, it is peace, as Jane Addams was pointing out. Ready for questions?
Emilio, thank you very much for giving us this perspective. Today we've been hearing about the mass movements of armies, the strategy and the tactics of war, but Jose de la Luz Saenz, with your editing and your publishing of his diary, gives us a completely different perspective of the war. You're absolutely right. This gentleman was giving us a perspective of the soldier himself in the war. Moreover, my comment would be that it's ironic that right now, as you were speaking next door, I just went there and I heard that paper, and that paper is about the same Mexican Americans that you're talking about of South Texas. But his title is "An Enemy Closer to Us Than Any European Power." And so, ironically, an American citizen can think that this gentleman is an enemy closer than any European power. He's saying that the Americans were afraid that the war was here. José de la Luz Saenz at the same time is over there saying, we're fighting here, but we have another war back home. And so I just think it's ironic when you look at the different perspectives. But in the end, the person who was doing the real fighting, that when he killed, he wasn't killing a U.S. citizen like they were doing in South Texas. He was killing a German enemy soldier. And it's ironic. I just wanted you to know, because you didn't have the opportunity to hear that. Yeah. Looks like my wife's got her hand up. But I'll leave it to James to hand it to her.
Well, let me just say one thing. In history, perspective is essential. You know, no one person captures all the possible perspectives on an event or an experience. It's necessary. This is one of the reasons why I do what I do on Mexican-American history. This is part of my call for us all to be inclusive. I mean, that is one important value in this country. We should be inclusive in the curriculum, with the curriculum. We should be inclusive in our relationships, in our networks. We should be inclusive when we talk about good things that we want for this country. We should be treating each other equally, not as enemies. And unfortunately, this may not be happening like it used to be, like they used to do it, very violently and openly. But I think you still find these kinds of public statements that create unnecessary divisions. I think a lot of times the immigrant or the minority is a better American than others, in part because they're seeking to gain favor, in part because they've come to value those basic foundational principles in this country, like justice, fair play, and so forth, because of their experience. So, you know, I think one of the things that I do, I'm involved in curriculum writing for the public schools, and one of the arguments I make is that we need to be inclusive. Women need to be there. Mexican Americans need to be there. African Americans need to be in there. They're also part of this experiment. And, but anyway, Juanita, thank you, Andres.
I've heard about the Plan de San Diego all day, and I'd never heard of this. I mean, I'd heard about it maybe 30 years ago. And it's ironic, the irony again, because it's supposed to be a revolt against, you know, siding with the other side. Mm-hmm. But my great-grandfather had 10 sons, and all of them were Tejanos. They were born in Texas. And the irony that I see is like, I had 2 uncles of those 10 brothers that that served in World War I. One of them had a Purple Heart. And then there was another incident that one of my great uncles, one of the brothers also, told me that during this revolt of the Plan de San Diego, one of those sons, another one, not that he didn't serve, he tried to join that revolt. But as you well know, in those days, the father had power over any son, no matter what age they were. So he went all the way to Palito Blanco or someplace like that and pulled that son out of that mob of revolutionary guys. I just thought I'd point out that.
Obviously, I mean, it's pretty obvious that we can't judge white people on the basis of the folks who went out and lynched African Americans. They weren't all doing that. They're not all evil. You know, we have different types in all the groups, obviously. And some people, politically speaking, we also have a great deal of diversity. Some people during this time period are pretty left of center. Jose La Luz Saenz was a moderate, and there's others that are very conservative.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. The first is, where did you find the diary?
Years ago, I was teaching a class. I knew about Mr. Saenz. I'd included him in my lecture on the civil rights generation, civil rights leadership of the 1930s. I mentioned him because he's one of the founders, and he continued being very active. And one of his grandnieces came up to me and said, "Thank you for mentioning my grandfather, I think." And she says, "Do you know that I have his diary?" I knew but I had never seen it, so she brought me a copy. And I made a copy for myself, and I started using it in my classes. And I waited for somebody else to translate. Translation is very difficult, and nobody else would translate it. I knew it had to be translated because it wasn't being used by people that can only speak English, including some Mexican Americans. But, you know, so I felt it my duty to then translate it. Years later, I discovered it maybe in 80 or earlier. But I didn't start working on this until about late, 2000 sometime.
You mentioned a publisher in San Antonio who published his book, and I'm curious what was the name of the publisher? Who was the publisher?
I don't know the name of the publisher. The publishing house is called Artes Gráficas. Artes Gráficas. And there's an outfit in the University of Houston called Arte Público Press. And they have a digitized collection of archives, and many of the publications in those archives include materials published by Artes Gráficas in Spanish for authors from here, as well as Mexico, Central America, and South America, back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. So it was a pretty major publishing house. We don't have I don't know of any single record from that publishing house in any university collection. So like many other archival records, they got lost. Yeah, it was a student that came up to me. And so I've had it for a long time, but I didn't start translating until much later. It's... got a question right
here. I read a book by a gentleman named Johnny Lewis, which was basically, the title of the book is A Brief History of World War I, Eyewitness Accounts of the Great War. And it's a compilation of letters written by soldiers, mainly British, French, German. Of course, I didn't see any from a Mexican-American soldier, but now we know where we have a source. But would you say there are other sources where we can maybe do some research and find accounts from African-American soldiers who served or other Mexican-Americans? Do you think there's any publications like that anywhere?
Well, first of all, I should say there's a a young man named Ramirez. It's Ramirez, isn't it, Andres, who wrote the book on Mexican-Americans in World War I. There's an article by Carol Christian in the Southwestern Stroker Quarterly, also on Latinos, Mexican-Americans in World War I. And there's a recent book that just came out, published by A&M Press, on different soldiers representing different ethnic groups participated in World War I. So that includes something on African Americans as well. There's Maggie Rivas, professor of journalism at UT Austin, has established an oral history project. They have more than 700 interviews with mostly World War II and now Korean, Vietnam, and Middle East conflicts of the soldiers and family members. So we have a great collection of interviews that are now archived at the Latin American Collection, and she has published books based on those interviews as well. anthologies as well as well, at least one single-authored book, and there's even a film. So Arte Pública also has a massive digitized collection. Universities are asked to buy it, and they give them 3 installments. There's a publishing house that digitized them, but they're available, entitled Arte Público Press. And within it, just to give you a sense of how important this is, all the Spanish language newspapers that were published from 1880 to the 1980s are in there, the ones that have survived.
Got time for 2 more questions, right?
Well, I have to. No, I was just wondering how it fits in with the Canary Islanders. Were they a completely separate group, or did they mingle with the Mexicanos or the Texians, or, you know, where did they stand? And also, I'd like to know, there were a lot of Mexicans that owned lots of property here in Texas that were very, very well educated. You know, how do they fit in with people like a plain soldier? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, he talked about the soldiers in general, and then the Mexican soldiers in particular. And in both cases, he talks about the young man who comes out of a farm out there, isolated, who's never gotten out forever, and now, you know, and then the big city, the young man for the big city. It's a real mix. You got the country bumpkins, so-called. Yeah, well, and usually the ones that are better educated are the ones that have the opportunity to be officers. But for the most part, the more socially marginalized groups like Mexicans are foot soldiers. He talks about a fellow from San Antonio named Perez, who comes from a well-to-do family, and he's not accepted, nor is Jose La Luz Saenz into the officer school. But the islanders, Canary Islanders, like the Native Americans and many Anglo-Americans, they get Mexicanized through, I mean, what do you think, Andres? They get Mexicanized and become part of the Mexican community. I didn't see any Mexican soldiers appearing in the diary that claim that kind of background. But I'm just assuming that the group varies according to the class, though the lower working class is well more represented among the Mexican soldiers and the rest of the soldiers.
All right, last question.
Did the diary talk at all about interactions with African Americans during the war, or other minority groups like the Native Americans or Irish or German?
African Americans are very segregated. He doesn't talk about any association with them. There are important instances when he talks about Native Americans from Oklahoma. The 90th Division is the Texas-Oklahoma Division. And so a lot of people from Oklahoma are in the division. At one point, he has an interesting story I always share with people, because you look at him, look at his features, and he privately says that he's Native American. He says, I'm not Mexican. I'm not Mexican American or Latin American, though publicly, when he's working with LULAC, he says he's Latin American. Privately, in his letters and in his private material, he says he's indigenous. So at one point, he goes to to write to his loved ones to the Salvation Army tent, and he goes and asks for paper and pencil, and they tell him, well, that group of young people, young soldiers over there, they took the last of the paper. Why don't you go and ask him? So he goes up there and he says, compatriotas. He starts speaking this real formal Spanish. You know, give me some paper. I want to write to my loved ones. And they start laughing at him. He's older than most of them. He's 29 when he joins. And so they start laughing at him. He feels very offended. And he starts telling them off and walks away. And one of the young men goes up to him and he says, look, we didn't mean to offend you, but you spoke to us in Spanish thinking we were Mexicans. We're Indians from Oklahoma. And then he reports that he says, oh, compatriotas, we're the indigenous people of the Americas, we the Mexicans, and you from Oklahoma. And then he says something that is really amazing. He says, we're the first armed contingent of native people coming from the New World to save the Old World. And that was true, I think.
All right, great, thanks.
Thank you.
Let's get another hand for both of our presenters.